On May 30th, 1966, NASA launched Surveyor 1, the United States' first attempt to make a soft landing on the surface of the moon, about 5 months after the Soviets achieved that feat earlier in the year. A mere 3 days later, on June the 2nd, 1966, Surveyor 1 successfully set down on the lunar surface, and 6 additional Surveyor missions were to follow. Of those 7 missions, only 2 failed, and those 2 failures actually managed to crash into the moon. All 7 actually made it to the moon, whereas 60 years later, we've had 2 new NASA missions, one of which didn't even make it to lunar orbit, although I still maintain that it probably could have made it to lunar orbit if NASA had allowed it to. And then we, of course, had the other that toppled over on the moon and was unable to complete at least part of its mission. Is space getting harder, or are we just getting worse at this? Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. Just got back from SpaceCom, all sorts of encouraging news about European spaceflight, private European spaceflight that is. A lot of upcoming launches happening this year from Shetland and elsewhere in Western Europe. A lot of reason to be excited about the state of the space industry, but at the same time, lots of reasons to be discouraged as well. A recent article in Gizmodo made a comparison of the state of spaceflight today compared to, say, the envisioned future of spaceflight that's talked about in shows like For All Mankind, really pointing out that we're still kind of stuck in the Stone Age. And why is this? After 60 years, why have we made so little progress? Well, I've done a number of reaction videos on this channel, although I generally do reaction videos to printed material instead of videos themselves because I just think printed material and printed editorials can cover these topics a lot more thoroughly. And let me tell you something, I'm not always a huge fan of what Gizmodo prints, but in this particular case, I think they got a lot of it spot on because the government and because society in general are not nearly as dedicated towards the success of spaceflight, towards mankind's exploration of the solar system. Since this isn't really much of a priority anymore, we're not seeing a whole lot of progress. And that doesn't bode well for our ambitions of going to the moon to stay, let alone colonizing Mars. I have to admit, I didn't know a hell of a lot about the Surveyor program until I started researching it for this video, and now that I've learned a lot about it, this whole thing has made me a whole lot angrier. The Surveyor 1 was not only successful in terms of landing on the moon, it was operational for about 30 days and transmitted more than 11,000 photographs during this mission, as well as data on the moon's surface and temperature. Even if these last 2 CLPS missions had been completely successful, they would not have been operational nearly this long. And here's something else. When you pull up the JPL website information about Surveyor 1, there's some links to a fact sheet on Surveyor 1 information on solar system exploration, and when you click those links, this is what comes up. This program has been utterly forgotten. And I'll tell you, that seems very disrespectful for an unmanned program that accomplished far more than we've been able to accomplish in the 21st century on the moon. And by the way, the Atlas Centaur rockets that deployed these things required only 63 hours to reach the moon. They flung them to their destinations far quicker back in those days than we are able to do today. How is this possible? Now, I'd like you to keep these facts in mind while I read the following article to you entitled, "When It Comes to Exploring Space, We're Still Stuck in the Stone Age" by George Dvorsky, on Gizmodo. I don't always approve of what Gizmodo publishes, but this one has a lot of really good points. Let's just get started. Quote, "We're rapidly approaching the quarter mark of the 21st century, but instead of being at the brink of a radical, transformative stage, such as the futuristic vision akin to Arthur C. Clarke's Star Child from 2001: A Space Odyssey, we're still throwing proverbial bones into the sky. Such is the feeling I get in the wake of 3 recent moon missions, in which 2 spacecraft, Japan's Slim and Intuitive Machines' Odysseus, survived despite falling awkwardly onto the lunar surface, while a third, Astrobotic's Peregrine, failed to reach the moon entirely. These episodes are making me feel grumbly and increasingly impatient about our space ambitions. Nice to know that I'm not the only angry guy out there when it comes to space news. How is it that we're still struggling with such things? Like, shouldn't this be a piece of cake by now? These missions were all successful in the sense that they moved the needle, but humanity's collective space needle needs to move a whole lot more in the coming years and decades if we're truly going to match the expectations set out by futurists, sci-fi authors, and, to be fair, most of the public in general. By establishing colonies on the moon and Mars, exploring the hidden oceans of distant moons, or embarking on interstellar voyages. These latest moon missions are an important reality check, reminding us of where we stand in the cosmological scheme of things. Space, as a meaningful place for humans to explore, work, and live, remains woefully out of reach. The recent forays to the moon emphasize once again that space is hard, but beyond this overworked, tired cliche, and by the way, I feel the same way about that cliche, these missions underscore how rudimentary our capabilities still are in terms of living and working in space. 50 years after Apollo, we're still struggling to land spacecraft on the moon, let alone live in orbital habitats, occupy Mars, or embark on crewed missions to the outer solar system. Apollo, and the space shuttle to a certain degree, left us with a false impression that space is now our regular stomping ground, but nothing could be further from the truth. Space, as a consequential working environment for humans, remains an illusion. We are stuck on this planet for the foreseeable future, regardless of what billionaire CEOs and their devotees might say. And I have to agree with that as well, actually. We have a long way to go before Elon Musk's dream of colonizing Mars can become a realistic goal at all. Just so many hurdles that still need to be jumped. The article continues by saying that terrestrial confinement continues to define the human condition, and in this aspect, we're far closer to the Napoleonic era than we are to the latest season of For All Mankind. This does not discount our litany of impressive space-based accomplishments. We've walked on the moon, built an international space station, placed robots on Mars, and sent multiple probes on journeys to the outer realms of the solar system, among many other technological feats. But stepping back, our abilities seem rather limited. First of all, virtually no one goes to space. Fewer than 650 humans have visited outer space. That's a sobering reminder that the final frontier remains an exclusive and elusive place for members of our species. For the privileged few that have had the opportunity to journey to space, missions typically range from a couple of weeks to 6 months, with rare instances being a year or more. Simply put, humans don't visit space for the most part, and those who do don't stay for very long. And as we're learning, the microgravity environment wreaks havoc on the human body, inflicting such problems as weakened bones, muscle atrophy, vision impairment, and altered cardiovascular function. We can develop as many advanced technologies as we like for traveling to and working in space, but until we discover methods to either prevent and treat these health conditions or adapt the human body to the space environment, we remain fundamentally bound to life at the bottom of Earth's gravity well. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that point of view. We really don't know how bad the effects of reduced gravity are going to be on the human body. We know what microgravity does, but is it going to be as extreme to live in 1/6 gravity on the moon or 1/3 gravity on Mars? Is it just going to be a reduced effect, or is it going to be a different effect entirely? I think it's a little early for us to make these kinds of determinations, and as far as living in space is concerned, there are artificial gravity solutions that have been at least hypothesized that stand a good chance of taking care of a lot of these physical problems. A little too early to say that space is too hostile for us humans to live there. However, I agree completely with the next paragraph. For those dreaming of space tourism, the reality is far from ideal due to the limited state of the technology and the absurd costs. Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin currently offer experiences that barely qualify as space travel, with brief flights that flirt with the Kármán line and last only a few minutes. Such fleeting journeys are a stark contrast to the envisioned future of the space tourism industry, which includes luxurious hotels orbiting Earth and scenic tours around Saturn's rings. And I agree with the next paragraph as well. As further evidence of our current limitations, a single company, SpaceX, dominates the market for rocket launches. That's intolerable and a hurdle that needs to be overcome. Rocket reusability remains the key innovation driving this near monopoly, prompting the rest of the industry to scramble to develop comparable solutions, none of which exist yet. Until SpaceX's competitors catch up, cost will remain a critical barrier to reaching space, in addition to rocket scarcity. Just ask Europe. Yeah, very good point. European companies, satellite manufacturers, the European Space Agency are finding it very hard to find a ride to space. Even though SpaceX is more than happy to sell some space on a Falcon 9, so many of their Falcon 9s are reserved for Starlink missions that any sort of prospective European mission to space has to wait for years before they get an opportunity, simply because the Europeans have no launch vehicle of their own yet, and Ariane 6 is going to be pretty expensive, but at least an alternative. And of course, the Russians no longer provide anybody rides to space unless they don't interfere with their current war in Ukraine. But the fact that we're talking about this, how one company can still dominate this realm, just reinforces that the space launch industry remains in a primitive state. That said, the industry has entered into an important new phase, with spaceflight evolving from a domain exclusively managed by governments to one increasingly dominated by the private sector initiatives. The race to monetize space is on, from lunar delivery services and commercial space stations through to the extraction of valuable resources from asteroids and the moon. Some of these new space ventures are being headed by billionaires, but the rest are startups depending on thin margins and speculative markets. Richard Branson's Virgin Orbit declared bankruptcy, as most of us know, and space tug company Momentus and rocket company Astra teeter on the edge as just a few examples of the current precariousness of the industry. If you don't have a billionaire founder, you're going to have a hard time making it in this industry. But these financial hurdles, though significant, pale in comparison to the immense technological challenges that these companies face. I am confident that commercial space stations and trips around the moon will eventually become a reality, but not imminently, and it's unlikely to be an experience accessible to the general public anytime soon. But the biggest problem this article points out are the astronomically limited budgets. The article goes on to say, I'm a big proponent of NASA's Artemis program. It may seem as though NASA is having to reinvent the wheel when it comes to returning boots to the moon, but these missions, when compared to Apollo, are a horse of a different color, both in terms of budget and the space agency's ultimate goal, making it possible to safely and sustainably work in lunar environment. Whereas Apollo was about getting astronauts to the moon and back as quickly as possible before they died, Artemis is dedicated to the long game and developing the tools and skills for eventually sending astronauts to Mars. Big things will come of this. Of that, I'm fully confident. By the way, I agree with this point of view. As for the timelines involved, however, I'm considerably less sanguine. Achieving seamless travel between the Earth and Moon and building the required infrastructure requires advanced technologies that are much farther than they appear. Moreover, a critical hurdle lies in the lack of enthusiasm for spending within the U.S. Congress, which holds the key to funding such endeavors. Without the requisite funding, progress in these areas will continue to advance at a snail's pace. NASA is increasingly turning to the private sector as a means to cut costs and foster innovation. A sensible strategy, no doubt, but the resulting shoestring budgets for these companies results in, well, those imperfect moon missions we saw earlier this year. Keep in mind that NASA, back in the early 1960s, and with nearly unlimited access to funds, regularly placed its Surveyor landers on the lunar surface in preparation for the Apollo missions. Indeed, money and the incredible resources it brings to bear can result in some extraordinary things, as Apollo proved, but the ideological landscape has changed radically in the last 50 years. Washington no longer views space exploration as a matter of existential importance, as it most certainly did during the Cold War, and federal funding has shriveled as a result. Apollo consumed a substantial portion of resources, with NASA receiving 5% of the federal budget. In contrast, today its allocation is less than 0.4%. People ask me, why are you so angry? Well, that's the main reason when I started this channel. There were two primary reasons, actually. One is the fact that NASA doesn't have much of a budget and doesn't spend it very wisely, especially on projects like SLS, but more importantly, NASA is trying to go back to the moon to stay with 8% of the budget that they had during the Apollo era. And you'd have to be crazy to think that this is possible, and yet NASA seems to believe that this is possible. The article goes on to say, the space agency is now burdened by an outdated and cost-inefficient rocket system, a direct consequence of prior decisions that failed to recognize pending technological advancements and financial practicalities. Cash-strapped NASA is stuck with SLS, and as a result, it'll have to operate at a plodding pace for the foreseeable future. And speaking of sluggish progress and outdated technologies, astronauts aboard the ISS are still using spacesuits that were built more than 4 decades ago. The article concludes by saying that we're having to learn and accept that space is a plodding affair with other priorities vying for attention. I'll be sure to remind myself of this the next time a lunar lander literally bites the lunar dust. As I say, I disagree with actually very little of what this article has to say, and in spite of all of the grandiose plans that Elon Musk may have, there are limitations that SpaceX is facing as well. Even though SpaceX has accomplished amazing things with Crew Dragon and Cargo Dragon, for the most part, they're doing exactly the same thing that the Russians were doing in orbit with their space stations back in the 1970s and 80s. SpaceX has yet to build a single vehicle that's capable of landing on another planet. And even though Lunar Starship is designed to do precisely that, it's very possible that it's not going to be ready to go until 2029 at the earliest. And even if it does, how much success is SpaceX going to have with their first few landings given how they develop things? The bottom line is, until Congress, until the government starts taking all of this seriously, until we realize that space cannot be explored on a shoestring budget, we are going to have to be content with a slow and plodding pace of advancement until eventually we do succeed, or until all of these failures and half successes saps our collective will to the point where yet another prospective rebirth of the space race ends in failure. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you new Patreon members Jim Sanger, Andrew Beaumont, and Will Taylor. I really appreciate your support, and thank you to all the folks who have made PayPal contributions lately to try to get me out to Boca Chica for this next Starship launch attempt on the 14th. I don't know about my odds because I've only raised about $150 up to this point, but if I don't make it to my goal, rest assured that money will be applied to a future flight here in the next month or two, so don't worry, your support will go to a good cause one way or another. And if you're interested in supporting my trip to Boca, well, all the details are in the description, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. And until we actually start taking this new space race seriously, and not just us spaceflight enthusiasts, but the government and the public at large, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.